Good evening. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On the NewsHour tonight, the balance of power comes into stark focus as President Trump calls for a federal judge to be disbarred and the Supreme Court hears a critical redistricting case.
Top Trump officials appear to accidentally share Yemen war plans via a commercial messaging app with Atlantic editor and Washington Week moderator Jeffrey Goldberg, who joins us with details.
And farmers across the country feel the impact of federal funding cuts.
It's heartbreaking to tell a farmer who is counting on it. And the season doesn't wait and the climate doesn't wait.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
On an American Cruise Line's journey along the legendary Mississippi River, travelers explore Civil War battlefields and historic riverside towns. Aboard our fleet of American riverboats, you can experience local culture and cuisine and discover the music and history of the mighty Mississippi. American Cruise Lines, proud sponsor of PBS NewsHour.
The ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour, including Leonard and Norma Chlorfine and the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for more than 50 years advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world at hewlett.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. In a U.S. appeals court today, the Trump administration challenged a federal judge's decision to stop the deportations of alleged gang members using a rare wartime authority.
The three-judge panel has yet to rule, but there was one apparent point of consensus among two of the judges, agreeing the judiciary does have the authority to review President Trump's actions. It's the latest chapter in the ongoing showdown between President Trump and the judiciary. Our White House correspondent Laura Barone-Lopez joins us now with the latest. So, Laura, this was a nearly 2-hour-long hearing in this D.C. appeals court on the Trump administration's use of this centuries-old Alien Enemies Act. What stood out to you?
So this three-judge panel includes judges appointed by President George W. Bush, Barack Obama, as well as Donald Trump. And there was one big point of agreement among two of the judges that spoke the most during the arguments. I'm talking about Judge Justin Walker, who is an appointee of President Trump, and an Obama appointee, Patricia Millett. And they were both skeptical of the Trump administration's arguments that essentially the president's actions are beyond judicial review. So they both said they believe that the judiciary can review this. Now, Judge Justin Walker focused his questions on whether or not D.C. was the right venue, saying maybe this lawsuit should be brought somewhere else. Now, Judge Patricia Millett focused her questioning on due process, and she basically said that there was no record that the people that were deported under the alien enemies were necessarily Tren de Aragua, or if they were maybe victims of Tren de Aragua. And specifically, Judge Millett said that there were plane loads of people. There were no procedures in place to notify these people who were deported, that Nazis got better treatment under the Alien Enemies Act than has happened here, referring to due process and hearing boards that were held the last time the Alien Enemies Act was invoked during World War II. The final big moment during the hearing, Amna, was that the Justice Department lawyer said that if the appeals court ruled in their favor, the government would immediately resume mass deportations under alien enemies without giving notice or without due process.
So it was Judge Boasberg who first ruled to block the deportations under that Alien Enemies Act. Before this appeals hearing, he stood by that ruling. Tell us what he had to say, and also, did this appeals court appear likely to uphold his ruling?
There's no way to know right now how the appeals court is going to rule, but Judge Boasberg did reaffirm his ruling, blocking the Trump administration from using the wartime powers for deportations. And in a 37-page opinion shortly before this appeals court hearing, Judge Boasberg said that he believed that the plaintiffs were likely to succeed on another equally fundamental theory. Before they, meaning the migrants, may be deported, they are entitled to individualized hearings to determine whether the act applies to them at all. So again, a similar argument to what Judge Millett was making in the hearing, that ultimately they believe that there needs to be due process here.
And of course, this whole court battle is playing out as the Trump administration continues its campaign against members of the judiciary, particularly Judge Boasberg. What should we understand about that?
Across the board, Trump officials have been criticizing and questioning the authority of the judiciary. Elon Musk has repeatedly said that Judge Boasberg should be impeached, and that's part of a pattern. We did a review, Amna, of Musk's posts on social media, his X platform, and Musk has made at least 94 posts criticizing the judiciary and their decisions since January. And other members of the Trump administration have jumped on board, including Attorney General Pam Bondi and Seb Gorka, an advisor to the president.
This is an out-of-control judge, a federal judge trying to control our entire foreign policy, and he cannot do it.
And there is one person, according to the Constitution, according to the statutes of the nation, who has the right to decide who can be in America, who are the aliens, who are the foreigners who are allowed into the nation, and who we keep out. That individual is the commander-in-chief, and that man is Donald Trump.
In addition to those two officials, President Trump has also attacked Judge Boasberg and the judicial branch, calling Judge Boasberg, quote, conflicted, and saying that he should be disbarred on them.
Laura, more broadly, what kind of response have we seen to this tension between the president and the judiciary?
Former federal judge J. Michael Luttig, a conservative, said that Trump is declaring a war on the judiciary. He wrote in the New York Times today that, quote, no one wants murderers or other criminals to be allowed to stay in this country. But to rid the country of them, the president must first follow the Constitution. Judge Boasberg does not want to assume the role of president. The president wants to assume the role of the judge. Now, Judge Luttig was ultimately optimistic that the judiciary would stand their ground here and provide checks and balances on the president. Other constitutional scholars I talked to said that it would take much more than just the judiciary to keep the president in line here, Amna.
Laura Barón-López, with the latest starting us off today. Laura, thank you.
Thank you.
U.S. negotiators held talks with a Russian delegation in Saudi Arabia today on a proposed partial ceasefire in Ukraine.
That comes one day after the negotiators met with the Ukrainian delegation. Both countries have agreed in principle to a temporary ceasefire, but major sticking points remain.
For now, though, the war grinds on. In Sumy, Ukraine, people stranded in their homes today after a Russian missile barrage set residential buildings ablaze. The attack injured the elderly and hit this school while children were sheltering inside. While thousands of miles away in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, high-stakes negotiations to try and iron out the details of a ceasefire. Two senior U.S. officials met behind closed doors today with the Russian delegation led by Moscow's former deputy foreign minister. That's after the U.S. met yesterday with the Ukrainian delegation led by that country's defense minister. President Trump today speaking to reporters.
We're talking about territory right now. We're talking about lines of demarcation. We're talking about power plant ownership.
But it's not clear the sides agree on exactly what has been paused in their limited ceasefire. The White House and Kremlin described it as a stop on energy infrastructure attacks, but Ukraine described it as a halt on energy and other civilian infrastructure. Also on the table, a deal to pause attacks in the Black Sea, where Ukraine managed to sink or push out Russia's fleet.
Putin's got a huge respect for the president.
It comes amid a 180-degree shift in U.S. policy toward Moscow. That was on full display when Special Envoy Steve Witkoff suggested in a weekend interview with Tucker Carlson that Ukrainians in 4 regions partially occupied by Moscow want to be part of Russia.
They're Russian-speaking. Yep. There have been referendums where the overwhelming majority of the people have indicated that they want to be under Russian rule. Will the world acknowledge that those are Russian territories?
Those September 2022 Kremlin-run referendums have been denounced as shams by the international community. Security footage from one of them shows a woman being led to vote by a Russian soldier carrying guns. Another shows an elderly woman monitored by a Russian soldier as she casts her ballot. Witkoff went further, imagining a total reset with Russia.
Thinking about how to integrate their energy policies in the Arctic.
Exactly.
Share sea lanes. Maybe send LNG gas into Europe together.
Back in Ukraine, until there's an across-the-board ceasefire, Ukrainians will continue to pick up the pieces after persistent Russian attacks.
We start the day's headlines with growing unrest in Turkey. Police have detained more than 1,000 people, cracking down on protests and dissent that began after the arrest of one of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's main political rivals. Union representatives said today that journalists were seized in their homes. Some of the massive demonstrations, the largest in more than a decade, were met by riot police with water cannons, tear gas, and pepper spray. The protesters and opposition see the jailing of Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, as a political ploy to remove him from the next presidential race. Erdogan defended the arrest today, criticized his opponents, and called the protests a movement of violence.
Son 5 gündür tanık olduklarımız.
What we have witnessed in the last 5 days has shown us the truth again. A country like Turkey has a main opposition party that is too small, too primitive, and too weak in terms of foresight, vision, and quality. It has become apparent once again that they could not be trusted to run a country, let alone local governments, or even a buffet.
Mayor İmamoğlu faces corruption and terrorism charges, which he and the opposition have decried as false. More aid groups have come under fire in the escalating violence in the Gaza Strip. The International Committee of the Red Cross said one of its offices in southern Gaza was damaged by an explosive projectile the Israel Defense Forces later said was fired by mistake. That comes as the United Nations has decided to temporarily scale back about a third of its footprint in Gaza after a recent Israeli strike hit one of its compounds. Israel, meanwhile, has been bombarding Gaza in recent days. Gaza's health ministry said more than 65 people were killed in just the last 24 hours, including 2 Palestinian journalists. The Committee to Protect Journalists now says more than 170 journalists and media workers have been killed in the war, the vast majority Palestinian. Back here at home, Dr. Susan Menares has been nominated to head the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, making permanent the acting role she already holds. Her nomination comes after President Trump abruptly withdrew his first pick, former Florida Congressman David Weldon, earlier this month. Also today, Postmaster General Louis DeJoy is stepping down from his post effective immediately. DeJoy, who has served in the role since 2020, had already led dramatic efforts to restructure USPS, including shrinking its workforce and cutting its budget. He'd recently asked Elon Musk's Doge team for help cutting further costs. On Wall Street today, stocks soared from optimism after President Trump indicated he might soften his tariff stance. The Dow Jones climbed by almost 600 points, while the Nasdaq made its own 400-point gain. The S&P 500 finished up after 4 straight weeks of losses. And a passing of note. Former U.S. Representative Mia Love has died. The daughter of Haitian immigrants, Love was a pioneer, the first Black Republican woman elected to Congress, representing Utah, a state that's overwhelmingly white. She was seen as a rising star within the GOP, but she distanced herself from Donald Trump. She lost to a Democrat while seeking a third term in 2018. Love suffered from brain cancer, and her daughter posted earlier this month that she was no longer responding to treatment. Mia Love was just 49 years old. Still to come on the NewsHour, 2 former heads of the EPA discuss the impact of cuts to the agency. The Supreme Court hears a critical redistricting case about race in Louisiana. And Tamara Keith and Amy Walter break down the latest political headlines.
This is the PBS NewsHour from the David M. Rubenstein Studio at WETA in Washington, and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Senior Trump administration officials, including the Vice President and Secretary of Defense, used the encrypted commercial messaging app Signal to debate the pros and cons of launching military strikes against the Houthis in Yemen.
And they accidentally invited the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic and Washington Week moderator Jeffrey Goldberg to be part of that chat group. Goldberg revealed the details today in a report published for The Atlantic, and he joins me now. Jeff, welcome to the NewsHour. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you're added to this group chat. You see some 18 or so other people on it. Among them appear to be senior national security and cabinet officials like Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, John Ratcliffe, Tulsi Gabbard, Stephen Miller, Steve Witkoff, Michael Waltz. How did you end up on this chat? And when do you realize it looks like you were added by mistake?
I was invited a couple of weeks ago to connect with Michael Waltz, the national security advisor. That didn't strike me as particularly strange, given my job and his job. A little while later, I'm added to a group chat with the people you just named. That seemed strange, but I kind of just ignored it a little bit. And then, it really became a very bizarre situation on Saturday, the 15th of March, when I was shared on a text in this group from somebody purporting to be Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. And this text contained operational military information, including the time that bombs were supposed to start dropping on Yemen. And this was 2 hours before that time. So I simply waited and stared at my phone. And sure enough, the American attack on Yemen began to be felt at about 1:30 Eastern or so, 1:50 Eastern. And that's when I realized that the chain was real. Until that point, I really had a deep suspicion that I was being spoofed or hoaxed or being led astray on a disinformation campaign, the rationale for which I can't figure out. But this all seems so improbable that I simply assumed that it couldn't be real.
And I want to point out, you share some details, you report some details of what unfolds on that text chain. When it comes to these operational details, though, you're very careful with your language. You write in your piece what appears to be from the account of Pete Hegseth posts, quote, operational details of forthcoming strikes on Yemen, including information about targets, weapons the U.S. would be deploying, and attack sequencing. This gets posted. 2 hours later, the bombings begin. And then what do you see unfold on the group chat?
A lot of happiness and virtual high-fiving. There's some reporting, again, material that I didn't feel comfortable reporting because it contained tactical operational information about the effects of the bombing on various places in Yemen. Mainly, it was the participants in this group chat, which, as you note, contained most of the national security leadership of the United States, congratulating each other and sending emojis, flag emojis, muscle emojis, fire emojis to each other in celebration of a successful mission.
We did hear from Brian Hughes. I know you did as well, the spokesman for the National Security Council, who sent a statement in response when you did reach out. He said that it appears the message thread was authentic, that they're reviewing how an inadvertent number, presumably yours, was added. He also says, quote, the thread is a demonstration of the deep and thoughtful policy coordination between senior officials. The ongoing success of the Houthi operation demonstrates that there were no threats to our service members or our national security. Jeff, you have reported on national security for decades, that this is being held up as an example of a deep and thoughtful policy coordination. Had you ever seen anything like this before?
I don't disagree with something that he said. If you look at the story in theatlantic.com, you'll see that they are having a live debate, including the Vice President of the United States, about the utility of attacking Yemen and the European component of this and various other things. There's interesting discourse going on. But according to everything I understand, they're not supposed to be doing this on commercial messaging apps. They got quite lucky that they included my phone number if they're going to pick an errant phone number. I mean, at least it wasn't somebody who supported the Houthis, because they were actually handing out information that I believe could have endangered the lives of American service people who were involved in that operation.
I guess the question here too, Jeff, is what don't we know? How many other group chats are there? Do you know how frequently Signal is used as in this sort of way at that level?
We don't know that. I am under the impression from administrations prior to this administration that Signal is often used by national security officials, but mainly as a planning device. What time is the meeting? That sort of thing. I have never in my life seen a commercial messaging app used to discuss whether and when and how to attack another country.
It is a stunning report. It's available in full at theatlantic.com. It's the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic and the moderator of Washington Week right here at PBS, Jeff Goldberg, joining us tonight. Jeff, thank you.
Thank you.
For more on the national security implications, we turn now to Leon Panetta. He served as Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA during the Obama administration, among many other roles in government. Welcome back to the NewsHour, sir. How does this lapse strike you from an operational security perspective, that the country's top national security officials shared information about an imminent strike, an imminent attack on a commercial messaging app?
Well, look, this is a serious security breach, particularly when it comes to war plans. Look, war plans, attack plans are among the most sensitive and classified information that you can have. And it has to be handled with care. I think it was a mistake to have a conversation on a Signal app that is not approved for sharing classified information. So I'm not sure why they even placed any of this information on Signal. But nevertheless, the fact that it included somebody who was not cleared for that information, and as a matter of fact was a member of the press, is a serious breach and one that needs to be fully investigated.
What are the traditional secure channels for this type of discussion? How would this normally unfold?
Well, when I was both director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, when it came to attack plans, the discussion was reserved for the Situation Room in the National Security Council, which is highly protected and is a place where you can have that kind of discussion without having to worry whether or not any of that information would leak. So I'm a little bit taken aback that they would have this kind of conversation on a commercial messaging network. That just strikes me as being pretty careless.
How might a foreign intelligence service, a foreign country trying to do the U.S. harm, how might they use this kind of information, or how might they exploit what appear to be lax security practices?
Well, there are very serious consequences to leaking information about a potential military attack. If that information is leaked to an adversary, not only does it jeopardize very important intelligence resources that are being used to be able to determine military plans, but in addition to that, that kind of leak would give a potential adversary an advantage of being able to strike first and going after whatever weapons, whatever naval vessels were going to be used for the attack. So it could cost lives of our men and women in uniform if that information was leaked. That's the danger here. And furthermore, it weakens our national security, very frankly, if we cannot protect that kind of sensitive information.
President Trump, when he was asked about this today by reporters, he said he didn't know anything about it, and then he quickly pivoted to criticizing The Atlantic. It doesn't appear that he's focused on taking accountability, and of course, he faced a criminal charges for mishandling classified information. That aside, in your view, what should the consequences be?
Well, I don't think there's any question that somebody made a serious blunder here, a serious mistake of including somebody that should not have been part of a national security group discussing war plans. So who added that name and why did that happen? That really does have to be investigated because it could involve a breach of our espionage laws, because that kind of breach simply cannot happen when the security of the United States is on the line. That is the danger of having that kind of information leak.
Former Secretary Leon Panetta, thank you for your time and for your insights, sir.
Good to be with you.
President Trump's efforts to overhaul the Environmental Protection Agency are being cheered by many in the fossil fuel industry who are critics of what they say is excessive regulation. But many, including scientists and environmentalists, are deeply concerned. Our William Brangham joins us now with more. William?
Jeff, the EPA's new administrator, Lee Zeldin, has been quite explicit, saying he is, quote, driving a dagger through the heart of climate change religion. That has meant enormous changes, ranging from laying off EPA scientists, repealing dozens of rules and regulations, to challenging the very idea that greenhouse gases endanger human health. We are joined now by two former EPA administrators. Christine Todd Whitman headed the agency under President George W. Bush and is a former Republican governor of New Jersey. And Gina McCarthy ran the EPA under President Obama, served as a top climate advisor to President Biden. Thank you both so much for being here. Christine Todd Whitman, to you first. You and Gina McCarthy have both been, Gina McCarthy, to you first. You and Christine Todd Whitman have both been very clear about the dismay that you see at what is happening at the agency that you used to run. When you look at the scale and scope of what is going on, what is it that most stands out to you?
Well, first of all, I thank Christy for all of her work and Bill Riley as well. We put out an op-ed just a few weeks ago on this. Look, they are challenging all of the fundamental tenets of what EPA stands for. First of all, we know that Administrator Leavitt has changed the mission of the agency from protecting health and the environment to American energy dominance. Now, how does that work for an agency that's trying to keep people healthy, that's trying to reduce sources of pollution, and do it in a way that's credible and consistent with the laws of our country? And so it is a sad moment right now because they're trying to dismiss 65% of the human beings that have worked so hard at EPA. And they're really looking at, dismantling all of the scientists, the Office of Research and Development, our Environmental Justice Office. So there is nothing that isn't at risk at EPA, but most importantly, the risk it poses to people in our country is extraordinary, and they have to be aware because we may end up having to protect ourselves if EPA isn't there for us.
Christine Todd Whitman, one of the things that Gina McCarthy just mentioned was the potential dismissal of a series of scientists, including those at the Office for Research and Development. For people who don't know, can you explain who those people are and what their dismissal or departure would mean for the agency?
Well, what it means is you basically stop doing research on new and potential problems for the public, for public health. I mean, these are the people that have done all the research on plastics, showing how organisms or micro pieces of the plastic are now getting into the human food chain, and why it's important that we start to deal with that. These are the people that are looking ahead. I mean, when we had the anthrax attacks, there was no standard for what was safe. One spore of anthrax, 15 spores of anthrax. That came back to us. It was the EPA that set the standard. I set it at 0. But the scientists followed that up to see what is the safe standard. So these are people who are working every day to protect us and to look for new areas where we might have problems, or things that we have seen as problematic in the past that are not so problematic now, that we figured out ways around them, or they're not as bad as we thought they might have been. EPA has a very simple mission, as I'm sure Gina said, which is to protect human health and the environment. And these scientists are focused on doing just that, on making sure that we anticipate where there may be problems and to address them as quickly as we can based on science. Emissions from cars, lead in pipes, it gets into the drinking water. EPA is the one who did the research to show the impact on children's health and development, brain development from lead in pipes, and passed the regulations to reduce that. So it really has, and these scientists are the ones that have a very real impact on people's everyday lives.
Gina McCarthy, President Trump, when he was a candidate, was crystal clear how he stood. He thought that climate change is not something to focus on. He said regulations, including those from the EPA, are hurting consumers. They are hurting the economy. He's clearly got a big constituency in the business community that agrees with him on a lot of those points. And he won the election. Is that not how democracy is supposed to work?
No, that's not how democracy is supposed to work. I mean, the president can have his opinions, but EPA is regulated by Congress. They establish laws. EPA is required under the law to implement the actions that Congress is demanding. And EPA has been doing that. But I think the bigger challenge is, let's not lose sight of the fact that, the federal government is really falling apart in so many ways. EPA is definitely one of the targets, but rest assured, we have to rally the troops in states and in local communities. And frankly, that's where I'm spending most of my time, actually working with Bloomberg on America is All In, because states also have legal authority. So we have to move forward and protect the interests of people in this country and protect our natural resources. And if the federal government wants to drop that charge, then the rest of the country is going to pick it up. And that's what we're working on now. And it is an enormous coalition that continues to grow. That includes businesses and institutions as well. So this is not just about states and local governments. It's about all of us trying to protect our interests of our children, in which climate change is concerned, protect our ability to live healthy lives and leave our children in a better position than we are in right now.
Christy Whitman, in 2009, this is specifically on this issue of climate change. In 2009, the EPA said carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases are a direct threat to human health. That finding has now allowed EPA to take a lot of action to combat the negative effects of climate change. The current EPA Administrator Zeldin says he wants to look at that finding again and potentially undo it. What would that do to the EPA's ability to address climate change specifically?
Well, it'd pull the rug out from under them. And if we haven't seen from these ever increasing storms, the severity of the storms, the droughts, the floods, the tornadoes, the real economic and human impact of what's going on, and you can't deny climate change. It's happening. I mean, we're not the cause of it, but we certainly exacerbate what's going on, and we need to be smart about figuring out how do we take advantage of new technologies to slow down what's happening, to prepare for the kind of impact that we're seeing around the country, and to do better with everyone. And nobody does innovation better than the United States, and that's where we should be focusing. What can we do to continue to grow our economy, actually to grow it faster because you can't have a healthy economy if people don't have clean water to drink and clean air to breathe, and if we don't try to harden ourselves against these ever-increasing storms and disasters that we see around the country.
All right, that is Christine Todd Whitman and Gina McCarthy, both former heads of the Environmental Protection Agency. Thank you both so much for being here.
Pleasure.
Thanks. Thanks, Christy.
The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments this morning in a dispute over redistricting that could reshape how state legislators draw districts based on race. The case centers on Louisiana's congressional map, which was recently redrawn to include 2 majority black districts for the first time in decades. The new map came after a federal court ruled the state's previous congressional maps discriminated against black voters in the state. Now, a group of voters who identify themselves as, quote, non-African American sued the state, arguing that the map is racially biased towards black voters. Joining us now to discuss the case is Amy Howe, who covers the Supreme Court for SCOTUS Blog. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So this case united different interests, Louisiana's Republican Attorney General and the voters who are represented by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Why is that, and how did this dispute end up before the Supreme Court?
So back in 2022, Louisiana drew a new map after the 2020 census, and Louisiana has 6 congressional districts, and roughly 1/3 of the state's majority population is black, and so it had 1 majority black district. So this group of black voters went to court challenging that, saying it was a violation of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits election practices that result in the denial or abridgment of the right to vote based on race. And so this federal district court threw out the map, agreeing with the black voters. The conservative U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit upheld that ruling and said, you need to draw a new map, state, or this federal court will do it for you. And so the Louisiana legislature went back to the drawing board, drew a second map with 2 majority black districts, and then this group of non-African American voters came to court saying that this violated the Constitution because it was an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. It relied too heavily on race. So the state and then the black voters that had challenged the first map both came to the Supreme Court to appeal. And the state says, look, we're between a rock and a hard place here. We wanted to address this violation of the Voting Rights Act, but we also, once we decided to do that, it was about politics. We wanted to protect 2 powerful Republican incumbents in Congress, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, and then Julia Letlow, who's on the powerful House Appropriations Committee.
What stood out to you today during the arguments?
So sometimes, you can, especially with this conservative court, you have a pretty good idea of where the court was going. Today was not one of those days.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the conservative justices clearly had some concerns about this map and about the shape of the second majority black district, but they spent a lot of time talking about some issues that weren't really before the court, whether or not the first district court decision throwing out the original map was correct, and whether or not the state should feel like it had to follow that court order. And then Justice Brett Kavanaugh raised the prospect, which he's raised before in an earlier ruling in 2023, that this idea of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act addressing race in redistricting is something that should have a logical endpoint, the same way the court held in cases involving, for example, affirmative action. So they were clearly skeptical, but it wasn't clear whether those kinds of sort of concerns are going to translate into a decision that upholds the map or throws it out.
The court heard a similar case, a nearly identical case, 2 years ago about Alabama's congressional map. What's the precedent there, and do the justices, would they feel bound by that precedent in this Louisiana case?
It was a 5-4 decision. It was a little bit of a surprise after the oral argument because Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh joined the court's 3 liberal justices in saying that Alabama likely did violate the Voting Rights Act when it created a map that had 7 districts. Only 1 was a majority black district, and roughly 27% of the state's population is black. And so there was that decision. And then there was a decision last term involving South Carolina. A group of black voters brought that case alleging that they had been moved out of Nancy Mace's district based on their race. The Republican legislature defending that map said this wasn't about race, this was about politics. We wanted to make that a safe seat for Republicans, and the Supreme Court ruled for the Republican legislature in that case. So we heard echoes of that decision from the lawyers for Louisiana and the Black voters today.
Amy Howe, co-founder of SCOTUS Blog. Thanks for coming in. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Since taking office in January, the Trump administration has moved to cancel or freeze trillions in federal funding. That includes billions in funding from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. William Brangham is back now with this report on how the funding freeze is affecting farmers.
They decided that was the best place.
Right.
It gets a lot of sun there.
These brand new solar panels on Scott Munro's farm are now up and running.
It shows production on a daily basis. If the sun stays out, we'll have good production today.
That energy powers Munro's shop and his grain dryer, which uses a lot of electricity, processing the 1,200 acres of corn, soy, and wheat that he grows here in central Pennsylvania.
In the peak months, we can have bills $3,000 to $5,000 a month, and we thought that this solar project would be the way to maybe help us with that.
To offset the cost of building the solar array, in 2023, Munro applied for a U.S. Department of Agriculture grant under its Rural Energy for America program. If the grant program hadn't existed, do you think you would have put this solar array in?
We weren't going to do the project if we didn't get the grant, so that's where we stood.
I see. He got one for $94,000, which covers about 40% of the cost. The way the grant is structured, Munro pays for the whole project up front, but after 30 days of operation, which he's hit, he's supposed to receive the grant money. But that is currently frozen.
It's in limbo. Are we going to end up footing the whole bill, which isn't really what we signed up for, or is it going to come through down the road and we're going to get the grant money? We just don't know at this point.
And how does that feel?
Not very good. Kind of cheated, you know, like that's what we signed up for. And now you're saying that's not what we're going to get.
While this grant program has existed since 2002, the funding for Munro's project and many others like it came from President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. In all, that law allocated nearly $38 billion over 10 years to the USDA.
I, of course, am hyper-focused on our ag producers.
In February, President Trump's Agriculture Secretary, Brooke Rollins, announced that some funding would be released, but that, quote, USDA continues to review IRA funding to ensure that programs are focused on supporting farmers and ranchers, not DEIA programs or far-left climate programs.
I get if your policies are different than the previous administration. I understand that, and going forward, if you want to change that, feel free. That's you're in charge now, you do that. But to take something away that's already been granted just doesn't seem fair to us.
According to one analysis, there are over 2,000 energy projects around the country like Scott Munro's that have been promised federal funds but now face this uncertain future. And that's not the only USDA grant program that's currently on hold.
If the Climate Smart program does get canceled.
Hannah Smith Brubaker runs PASA Sustainable Agriculture. In 2023, this Pennsylvania nonprofit received a USDA Climate Smart grant worth up to $55 million over 5 years to work with farms across 15 eastern states on environmentally sustainable practices.
For the first time, small, mid-size, highly diversified farms that are farming in a way that really are responsive to the ecological needs around them, were really getting noticed, and dollars were starting to be directed their way.
But now, that funding is abruptly on hold.
Those farmers trusted that the agreement they had with us and that we have with the federal government was unquestionable.
Right, you signed contracts.
Exactly. It's heartbreaking to tell a farmer who is counting on it, and the season doesn't wait and the climate doesn't wait.
Within that handful, we have our typical blend of rye, vetch, and clover.
Second-generation organic farmer Will Brownback is showing off his cover crop, which is an off-season planting to protect his lands.
Oh, and look, got ladybug right in there.
Yeah, look at that.
His farm has done this for years, but was supported last year by a PASA grant.
It's not something that we're making direct money off of, but it helps stabilize the soil, provides habitat, eliminates erosion. It's really disappointing that some farmers who want to be able to do this on their farms but need a little bit of help to get going with it are unable to do it right now.
In Northeast Pennsylvania, Liz Krug is the co-owner of Endless Roots Farm, which grows vegetables year-round on about 10 acres. Her farm is also a recipient of a PASA climate grant.
It was financially helping some of the practices we had already been doing. Looking forward, it was helping to fund some projects that maybe were a bit financially out of our reach.
That includes adding new cash crops in the future, like blueberries. Without the grant, that's a stretch for a small farm working on leased land.
I'm not saying that it's completely out of the picture without this grant. It would
It's just a riskier proposition.
Right, it would
financially.
just take us a lot longer to decide that we would want to do that.
In April, Hannah Smith Brubaker's organization will be furloughing almost all its employees. And last week, it joined a new lawsuit against the Trump administration. On top of grants being frozen, she says the recent decision by USDA to cancel $1 billion in funding for schools and food banks to buy food locally directly impacts farmers.
It just seems like at every turn, regardless of how honestly you engage in securing the funding or stewarding the funding, it's just disappearing.
Members of this administration argue that, look, priorities are changed now. They argue that some of these types of programs are DEI or left-wing climate initiatives. What do you say to that?
They're out of touch with reality. Farmers are dealing with the climate every single day. They are desperate for help. So if we're serving farmers, listen to the farmers. This is what the farmers want.
Back at Scott Munro's farm, he's hoping the grant he was awarded for his solar project comes through, but he's not counting on it.
Maybe they'll calm down and realize some of the things they did, are hurting people whom a lot of people in that industry voted for them. So,
if the grant doesn't come, Munro will have to swallow the almost $100,000 he's already spent. In the meantime, spring is here, and it's nearly time to start planting. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham in rural Pennsylvania.
For more on the fallout from today's top stories, I'm joined by our Politics Monday team. That is Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter and Tamara Keith of NPR. Great to see you both. Tam, kick us off here. I want to begin with that stunning Atlantic report by Jeff Goldberg about being added to a national security group chat about military operations unfolding on Signal. What kind of reaction are we seeing among lawmakers to this?
I think some very telling reaction is from the President of the United States, who was asked about it and essentially said, I don't know. He said, you're telling me about it for the first time. This was hours after the story broke, and he's claiming not to have been briefed on this major national security breach. You have lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, bicameral, all of it, concerned, very concerned about this, because this was a breach. The question is, in an administration where the President of the United States has given himself, his White House broad authority to give security clearances to pretty much anyone they want without going through the process, are they going to take this seriously or not?
Amy, what's your take on that? They'll take this seriously or not?
Well, I think the first place we're going to look is what do Republicans in Congress decide to do? I think it's pretty clear that had there been a Democratic president in office, that this had happened under their watch, I would expect to see Republicans rise up and say there must be hearings here. Remember, Congress is a co-equal branch. Their job is to hold the executive branch responsible and to dig into these sorts of incidents. Now, Democrats right now are calling for these level of hearings. We're not hearing that from Republicans yet. They come back today, tonight, and I think that would be something that you could see if we have these conversations a lot on this between the three of us about whether we're seeing an adequate position and when it comes to the three branches, whether the legislative is holding the executive accountable. Where does the judicial fit into this? Here's a perfect example where the legislative could be holding the executive accountable for this. I don't expect to see it happen, but maybe.
We shall see. Well, meanwhile, while I have you both, I want to ask you about events over the weekend. Thousands of people we saw turn up to a rally in Denver, Colorado. It was headlined by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders. Tam, as you saw, it was billed as part of their Fighting Oligarchy tour. What do you take away from the size of the crowd, from the reaction of the crowd, and also just the messaging that Sanders and AOC were giving there?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of pent-up Democratic energy looking for a place to go. Among voters, among Democratic voters who are deeply frustrated with what they're seeing out of Washington, wondering, where is the leadership? What is the party that they voted for and followed? What is that party doing? And it is notable that Bernie Sanders is an independent, and he is both caucuses with Democrats, but is also quite critical of Democrats. In terms of the message, a lot of the economic message is something that other Democrats do actually want to. It's a very similar message to what other Democrats are looking to push headed into the midterms. As President Trump ran on bringing down grocery prices and other prices, and prices are still high. It's a contrast that other Democrats are trying to also figure out how to make.
Amy, when you see this, we've talked a lot about what direction the Democratic Party will take. Does this tell you what direction it's going to take?
Well, it's interesting. This is less ideological than it is stylistic. It is about the fight itself, not over the issues that they're fighting for. As Tam said, it is correct. What you're hearing from Chuck Schumer and what you're hearing from Bernie Sanders on making the economy the centerpiece and specifically holding the Trump administration responsible for many of the policies they want to put forward and may ultimately put forward. That's going to be similar. It's the way in which they go about making the case. And I think we will see whether what is going on right now at these town halls is a sign of broader dissatisfaction with Democratic voters at the way that the leadership in Washington is handling Donald Trump. It will show up, I think, first and foremost in party primaries. We're going to start to see folks announce for congressional seats soon enough. And will these primaries, much like we saw when Republicans were they were not in the White House, they were trying to get back in the White House, will we see something similar where we will have something of a Tea Party? We saw back in those days in the 2009, 2010, and of course with Trump, this idea, the same thing. We need to see people fight more. In many cases, some of those fighters turned out not to be great general election candidates. That's a big question going forward, I think, for Democrats in this next few months.
All right, that is Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter and Tamara Keith of NPR joining us as always for Politics Monday. Thank you to you both.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On behalf of the entire NewsHour team, thank you for joining us.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by Friends of the
A successful business owner sells his company and restores his father's historic jazz club with his son. A Raymond James financial advisor gets to know you, your passions, and the way you bring people together. Life well planned.
It really matters when you have an opportunity to give back.
Being part of something that's bigger than myself, that's what brings me happiness.
Being able to integrate your professional career with some of these other things that are important to you, it's critical to be happy at the end of the day.
You know, this is our community too, and we want to participate and give back to it.
People want those opportunities to make an impact and a difference.
In 1995, two friends set out to make wireless coverage accessible to all. With no long-term contracts, nationwide coverage, and 100% US-based customer support. Consumer Cellular. Freedom calls.
Certified financial planner professionals are proud to support PBS NewsHour. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
The John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. More information at macfound.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.